to thank everyone here today coming to listen to us talk and learn about our work. We really appreciate it. So as Elizabeth mentioned, I'm going to be talking about a new project that we are undertaking at the Moore Center that's focused on the commercial sexual exploitation of children and state responses to that issue, which are known as safe harbor laws. So just to give you a quick roadmap as to where we're going to go in this presentation, I'll give an overview of commercial sexual exploitation of children, also known as CSEC, because we all need more acronyms in our life. So if I say CSEC, that's what I mean. And then I'll go into a discussion of policy responses around the commercial sexual exploitation of children and how we are researching this at the Moore Center, and then future directions for this policy and our work. So what do we mean when we say commercial sexual exploitation of children? Well, one, we can think narrowly in the sexual commodification of children's bodies, right, for the purposes of monetary gain. In sort of general conversation, people refer to this as juvenile prostitution, right? So I find that term problematic, right? Juvenile prostitution implies that youth are able to legally consent to the sexual behaviors, right? Where if we removed the monetary aspect, we would call it what? Child sexual abuse, right? Commercial sexual exploitation of children is one form of child sexual abuse, one form of many. So the question of how many youth are involved is a very tricky question to answer. It is. The estimates that we have available vary widely. So we have estimates of 1,400 to 2 million. And the reality is the science around these estimates is not great. We simply do not know how many youth are involved in CSEC. But we do know how many youth come into contact with law enforcement, right? We're able to measure that. And it's generally in several hundreds, right? So in 2005, about 1,400 youth were arrested for juvenile prostitution nationally. And by 2012, that number dropped to around 600, right? So we're seeing declining numbers of youth being arrested for prostitution-related offenses. And so what's emerging now across states and across the country is an attempt to reframe juvenile prostitution as victimization and taking that out of the juvenile justice framework, taking the stigma of having contact with the system. We're trying to remove that. These policies are known as safe harbor laws. So states vary significantly in how they implement safe harbor. Safe harbor is sort of an umbrella term for dealing with CSEC in a new way that emphasizes the victimization of youth and not the offending behavior of youth. So how that occurs sort of varies between states, but generally in my review of the statutes, what I find are sort of three overarching philosophies, right? So one, an acknowledgement that youth involved in prostitution are victims, right? They're victims. They come from histories of physical and sexual abuse. They come from families marked by dysfunction and neglect. And they come from communities that experience disadvantage and poverty, right? So states are recognizing that kids in this situation are victims. They're also recognizing that sexually exploited children have current needs that far exceed the capabilities of the criminal and juvenile justice system, right? So they're currently experiencing violence, they're currently experiencing housing instability, and they are currently experiencing a host of physical health, mental health, and behavioral problems. And all of these things working together, the intersection of all these problems, exceeds the resources and the scope of the criminal and juvenile justice system. Some states are decriminalizing juvenile prostitution. So what they're saying is, we are no longer going to be arresting youth and charging them with prostitution-related offenses. Other states are relying on diversion. So either with decriminalization or instead of decriminalization. So some youth might be picked up by a police officer and taken immediately into social work or some other social service sector. Other youth in some states might be arrested, but then after arrest will be diverted into services. We've also seen in states that have implemented safe harbor laws an increased focus on access to social services. So trying to determine what the needs are of the youth, and they are many, right? So we see a need for substance abuse counseling, mental health treatment, housing services. So we see a variety of needs for youth. And so what we see is across the country, about 18 states are designated as safe harbor states, which mean that they have implemented some form of safe harbor policy. Now, California is a little different. California is not a safe harbor state, but some counties have taken the initiative to develop safe harbor policies within their jurisdiction. So Alameda County is one of them, that for the past several years have been working to decriminalize and divert youth into services rather than arrest. And other counties are now trying to use Alameda County as sort of a model county. But statewide, it has not been implemented. Maryland is not a safe harbor state. So states that have no safe harbor implementation means that they arrest as usual. Now, as I mentioned, there's extreme variation in the types of policies and how these policies are implemented within states. So if we just look at decriminalization, right? In some states, Tennessee, for example, they will not arrest a youth who's younger than 18 for prostitution-related offenses. So they do not arrest. So they've decriminalized juvenile prostitution. However, the youth is, once picked up by the police officer, is taken back to their home and given a pamphlet for services, right? And other states decriminalize but have a more formal system of providing access to services. We also see variation in age restrictions. So often there are age restrictions within states that decriminalize, and it usually matches the age of consent, but not always. So for example, Texas decriminalizes. They do not arrest youth for prostitution if the youth is 13 or younger. And so our goal is really to advance this literature. So in service to this goal, we have sort of three main research questions. First, we're sort of taking a 30,000 feet look. Nationally, we're seeing smaller numbers of youth arrested for prostitution-related offenses. So what we want to know is what is the trend, and can we tie it to federal legislation that's passed that has attempted to decriminalize juvenile prostitution? And has that policy been effective? Then, if we narrow our focus a little bit, we are working with several states that have implemented different types of safe harbor policies, and then also collecting data from states that have not implemented safe harbor policies to answer a key question. And that question is this: are youth protected by some level of safe harbor policy less likely to have another contact with the criminal or juvenile justice system than youth in states with no safe harbor protection? So the idea of safe harbor is to provide services so that they don't come back into the system. And so we're attempting to gauge how effective that is. And then finally, we want to know, in states that have implemented safe harbor, so getting a more narrow focus, in states that have implemented safe harbor, what has been the experience of the key stakeholders, the people on the ground, right? So within law enforcement, treatment providers, people within social work. What has been the experience? What are some of the barriers? How have they attempted to overcome those barriers? And then my final point today, which I think is sort of always our theme at the Moore Center, is that in talking about commercial sexual exploitation of children and safe harbor policies, the focus here is on after-the-fact responses. It's on reactions to offenses and abuse that has already occurred. And I think what we need to do, the conversation that we need to be having around commercial sexual exploitation, is that it is child sexual abuse. It's child sexual abuse. It's not a distinct element, right? It's child sexual abuse. And as such, it's preventable. We can prevent it, which means we need to focus our energy and our resources on prevention. And so I think that is the conversation as we move into the future that we really need to have around commercial sexual exploitation.